Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Liam Dann, New Zealand Herald Business Editor at Large. This is a podcast where we talk to New Zealanders about money and how it has shaped their lives. We're not going to tell you how to get rich. We're not even going to pick the next interest rate move. But we are going to get you thinking about your relationship with money and what it really means to you. With me today, I have Sir Michael Cullen, former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. Hi, Michael. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Liam. It's good to be on.
Look, can I start by asking, and I ask all the guests this, if you can remember what the earliest memory you have of money in your life, or when you first, if you remember holding money at a young age?
No, I don't remember holding money at a young age. I'm sure I got pocket money from my parents. My parents both working class people in background, but we were a bit better off than most working class people because my mother went out to paid employment for most of her life. And particularly when we came to New Zealand in 1955, that seemed to be quite unusual for a woman of her age. She was in her early 40s at that point. So we tend to be a little bit better off than the average person, I think.
So there was a sort of...
First time I sort of earned money was going... I've always wanted not to admit this to Helen, was working in a tobacconist shop in Christchurch when I was about 14.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a real sort of, those were quite sort of popular community type shops in those days, though, weren't they?
Oh, they were. They were indeed. I mean, most people smoked in those days and carried a wide variety of things, and people sort of bought gifts and things like that. So, yeah, it was quite a busy little shop right near Cathedral Square.
Yeah, actually, I think I remember that. It was still there next to the movie theatres, even in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah.
Okay, so but growing up, so you started life in the UK. Your parents were sort of working class British people, which I guess traditionally with a bit more class consciousness in the UK. I mean, did you feel that growing up?
Oh yes, you couldn't really miss the class conscious nature of UK society. And in a funny kind of way, I think the development of modern media like television, and we had a television for about the last year or so that we lived in the UK, 1954, 55, made you more aware of it because you saw much more. I think it became even worse when you had commercials coming on, which of course we didn't in those days, the UK. It was all BBC. Because then you saw all kinds of things being advertised which were completely foreign to the concepts of the kind of people that were living around you. So we lived in one of those sort of classic terrace housing areas in North London. As I say in a book that I'm trying to write at the moment, the only difference was that we were a semi-detached house because the Luftwaffe were taken out about the next 6 houses in the row during the war. We hadn't moved in at that point. We moved there in 1947.
So as a child or a young teenager coming to New Zealand, did you feel a difference in the way that the world worked and the attitudes were to money around you?
I don't think there's a big difference. I mean, this was in 1955, and of course, wages in New Zealand at that point were still higher than they were in Britain. So although my father wasn't able to carry on his trade because it didn't exist in New Zealand, and essentially went into a sort of semi-skilled job assembling fluorescent lights, he was actually paid more than he was paid in England for fewer hours working than he worked in England. My mother found work reasonably easily here. So the difference for us was that we moved into a brand new, it wasn't brand new area, but the houses were brand new, backing onto a market garden. And it seemed pretty primitive by North London standards. I mean, we had a chemical toilet and a night saw a man come around once a week.
Yeah,
it was just sort of a bit of a hold on to yourself for the last day before they came, and it didn't have a mains water supply. It was an artesian well, and we didn't have a proper roading construction. There was no proper curbing or channeling, anything like that. There was a sort of open ditch along the front. This was all sort of kind of frontier stuff compared with living in late 19th century North London housing.
Yeah. If I can jump back to that first job, for example, and so you're in the tobacconists, you're earning, whether it was shillings or whatever in those days.
£3.12 and sixpence, I think it was a week. I can't remember exactly. I think that was it.
So what would you have spent that on? Were the things that you have hobbies that you were indulging, or?
Well, yes. I'm getting to really quite an interest in classical music. So one of the things I bought was one of those little Gerard, was it named? Little little one-piece record players.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And joined what was then the World Record Club, and was buying classical music. I can remember most of my early records, 12-inch. Well, actually, I think one of the first ones was a 10-inch LP, and then 12-inch LPs.
It's actually, it's reasonably well known in your story that you were I think you've heard it told before that you're the first in your family to go to university. Was that seen as a big step in?
Oh yes. Well, the big step, of course, first was getting a scholarship to Christ's College. My mother was set on that ambition, and because my sister had been ill in England and had to leave grammar school and go to a secondary modern school, her opportunities for further educational advancement have been significantly reduced. The British school system was very kind of class-based as well. In those days. So I was the sort of bright hope of the family now. So going on to university, particularly from Christ's College, where of course an awfully large proportion compared with the norm in those days tended to move on into university or other tertiary education, seemed the natural thing in the top stream out of that school.
It would have changed the expectations. Once you got to Christ's College, the expectations of going to university, I mean, that was almost the constraint in those days. It wasn't the cost in the sense of the fees and things. It was more just the expectations, the mindset around it.
Yes, the fees were very small, and in those days, I mean, the opportunities for getting holiday employment, particularly during the long vacation, were very high. So the great majority of students, even the women students, were able to earn some money during that vacation, and as long as the parents weren't charging me board and lodging, which they didn't, bless them, I was able to get by and buy myself a little scooter to get into the university and so on and so forth.
So I know things weren't maybe as tough, or we didn't have student loans and things, but were there times when you were living that sort of classic poor student lifestyle, sort of?
Well, I went flatting in my fourth year, I think it was, 1966. I went flatting with three friends. All males, of course, because in those days you didn't have mixed flats. In the Trolley University, we had that sort of thing going on. I never felt sort of deprived or really pushed. I was always on a scholarship when I was at university. I won a junior scholarship in the seventh form, or the upper sixth, as we used to call it. Then I won a senior scholarship at the end of my BA. So although I'd taken up a studentship before I went to university, I gave it up before I got there because I'd won the junior scholarship and then the senior scholarship. So with that, which wasn't a huge amount of money, I think it was about £3 a week from memory at the time, but with holiday earnings as well, it was possible to get by okay. And yeah, of course, you didn't have lots of goodies, but you could also buy, sides of Hogget and things like that, which made living relatively cheap.
What was this holiday work for you at that stage?
Oh, I did a wide variety of things. I mean, the first summer vacation after leaving school, actually, my parents sort of paid me to paint the outside of the house, which needed doing by that point. But then I moved on to things like the worst job I did was building terrazzo paneling. That's that sort of concrete set with stones and stuff. And you had to sort of grind it off by hand, and they didn't even give me gloves to start with. So by the end of the first day, every capillary in the ends of my fingers was bleeding away. That was a rotten job, and much nicer job where Dad worked for a long time, Claude Neon's. 1 year assembling fluorescent lights, another year doing metalworking, which I hadn't done at school, I only woodwork. Doing metalworking, making the sort of bodies, and also working in a fridge factory, making fridge bodies. That was another metalworking job.
But those jobs, often they're quite people often find that something like the grinding the stone and concrete is a sort of a prompt to let you know or to teach you what you don't want to be doing, that you kind of.
Well, yeah, I think in part, but also, I mean, it's an experience you carry with you through the rest of your life when you're engaged in work which you find more interesting, certainly more economically rewarding, financially rewarding, But it reminds you that, these jobs, well, perhaps not some of those particular ones, but jobs like that still carry on. And that most jobs, I mean, even being an MP, there is a fair amount of routine and drudgery that goes into it. And all jobs, I think, pretty much have that kind of aspect.
I still have days where I romanticize. I was a shopping trolley boy. Get the shopping trolleys, collect them up, get them in. There were days it was horrible, but it was actually very satisfying because it was very simple, and you achieved your goal at the end of the day, and they're all tucked away.
Yeah, that's right. And you sort of saw these fridge bodies emerging and knowing going off they're going to be made into fridges, and people were going to buy the fridge, and there was a sense of doing something useful as well as getting paid.
So coming out of university, you had an academic career for a while.
Coming out of university, well, obviously went over to Edinburgh with my first wife. I was on a UK Commonwealth scholarship. Yep. So again, the issue of not being well off didn't arise because that was quite generous.
Yep.
And Rowena, my first wife, had a small scholarship. So the two added together meant that we were quite reasonably well off, and we lived in the sort of semi-basement of this huge Victorian house. And there was a big coal-fired central water heating system with the pipes running around the semi-basement. So we only needed one little kerosene heater to get us through a Scottish winter. So we had sort of cheap heating, relatively cheap power. Cost of living wasn't too bad. And we were reasonably well off. I managed to run a somewhat clapped out old car, which blew up a couple of months before we left. So all good, and then came back to New Zealand to a position midway up the lecturer scale in Otago University. Bought a house which cost less than twice my gross salary, not counting Rowena's when she started work at the library. So I mean, you're thinking in terms of, all right, 26 years old, but here we are moving into our own home with a mortgage, thanks to a bit of help from my parents, which I managed to pay them back, which was not much more than my gross salary, less than the gross salary combined of Rowena and myself. So you think of young people in similar situations today, very, very much more difficult unless their parents are well enough off to give them enormous assistance into buying a house, or they're renting at quite a high price compared with their likely income. So I think in a way it was easier to be well off without being, really highly paid.
Yeah.
In at that time, early 1970s, than it is today for young people.
Was there ever a sense where you realised, okay, we've got a little bit of money now, I'm going to indulge this or that? Did you able to sort of spend a bit more on holidays or?
We spent a lot on doing up the house. It needed a lot of work, and I did the great majority of that work. But there were obviously some skilled jobs like re-roofing and plumbing, which I wasn't able to do, and that was something I enjoyed enormously. Yes, But our holidays usually were things like going up camping to Lake Wakatipu or something like that. We didn't have sort of expensive overseas holidays. And I think one of the problems about comparing standards of living now with even 50 years ago is that expectations around some things, at least amongst middle-class people, have greatly increased.
Yeah,
people got used to the idea of overseas holidays. They have COVID, and people can't go to Australia, or they can't go to Singapore or Thailand, and this is a sort of great deprivation. Well, equivalent people in the 60s and 70s didn't usually think in terms of those sort of holidays. They might have a batch, but most people didn't. Or crib, as we would say down in the south of the South Island. They go camping or little tour around or something, and that was the holiday.
And there wasn't the huge range of consumer goods either, right?
So no, but they were expensive. I mean, I can still remember we got a television the first day it arrived in Christchurch, because my mother in particular missed television for 5 years in New Zealand, and it was £149 10 shillings, or just under $300. Well, $300 in relation to an income in 1960 was far more than you pay today for a television which does far more things than a black and white television did, and much smaller in 1960. Those sorts of things like washing machines and dryers, they are all much cheaper now than they were then, in comparison with people's wages, and much better. I mean, they might not sometimes be quite as robust, but they certainly deliver much more in terms of services than was true then. So we have, in many ways, as long as your income is somewhere near the average or above, we actually do have a higher standard of living than we had 40, 50, 60 years ago. But we don't realise it because those changes have crept along, and we haven't thought back, well, okay, so when I bought a car, if I could afford to buy a new car, or indeed if I was allowed to buy a new car under the arrangements in the 1960s, what did you get compared with buying even a sort of $25,000 new car today? I was just looking at some yesterday, thinking of downsizing from my somewhat over luxurious car at the moment, and it was surprising all the things that were on it, what it did compared with a car not so very long ago. So those things are increases in our standard of living that we easily ignore. But the problem is that there is a significant section of the population which is cut off from those opportunities. And I mean, some of them are still, living hand to mouth and reliant on people coming around in trucks selling their goods, which are twice the price of what they could go down to the supermarket for if they could afford to do it.
It goes back to that earlier point you made about choices, and the poverty is the lack of choice and the lack of ability to see the choices.
Exactly. I mean, what I think a degree of affluence gives you is that ability to have choices in life. And one of the things where I tend to be somewhat hard on the sort of green movement is that I agree with so much of what needs to be done, but I keep trying to tell them you can't promise to impoverish people as the way to solving climate change. I mean, people aren't going to vote en masse for impoverishment, so we actually have to somehow square that circle. We've somehow got to maintain a decent standard of living while we have, serious attention being paid to those kinds of issues that we face by poverty in one sense and climate change in another.
Have you had, thinking about personal finance and structuring finance, and once you've started to have a little bit of extra money, I mean, you famously got the country sorted with the New Zealand scheme. Have you been, good personally with doing all the right things, personal finance?
I've been a very conservative saver. I mean, I've never ventured outside the bank really. We have a beautiful house in Port Hope. It's been mortgage free for years. We've got a swimming pool in it. I mean, we live a lovely lifestyle in a lovely place. And I couldn't think of anything better than the kind of lifestyle that we live. And no doubt the house is bigger than we ought to have by now. But
about not, the extra earnings that you could make taking more risk, that kind of thing.
I could certainly, and indeed, I think for the first time in my life, I'm thinking, good God, at 0.3% interest on my main deposit in the bank, take off tax. Even with low inflation, I'm going backwards. I'm going backwards each year at the present time, apart from starting to draw down a little bit on savings. But I'm very well off by the average person's standard. When you see surveys of how much most elderly retired people have in assets, it's remarkably little, and doesn't go very far at all beyond immediate needs and paying for a funeral and a bit more than that. Whereas we can cope. Last year I had an advanced prostate diagnosis. I didn't even think. I mean, I just went and got it done privately because I could afford to do so. And was that bad or not with in terms of my principles? I'm not sure. I mean, it freed up the public space. On the other hand, does it divert middle class attention away from funding properly the public health system? There's a terrible conundrum.
It highlights the idea that, to some extent, you're wealthy, and I actually think John Key said this, in some respects being wealthy is just not having to worry about the fridge breaking down or
Yes, that's right. That's right. I mean, we just went and got a new dryer because it's starting to clanky, and we only a few weeks ago got a new washing machine because the ball bearings were starting to make a hell of a noise. It's bugger this, let's go and get a new washing machine. For a lot of people, they've got to think carefully before they can do that, and for many people, they can't go get a new washing machine. They've got to go get a second-hand one.
The way you've structured things, all that stuff suggests that money in itself hasn't been a goal in life, really.
No, money itself is not a goal in life, and we're not. Anne and I aren't spendthrifts. We enjoy wine, but we normally go and sort of get the stuff from the wine clubs and so on, and we have to about $15 a bottle. We don't go mad anymore. We used to. I mean, when I was Deputy Prime Minister and Anne was full-time teaching, when they would go out around the wineries in Hawke's Bay and pay $35 a bottle 15 years ago, but we don't do that now, partly because the cheaper wines have improved a lot in quality anyway over that time. I do have a Jag, a 3-year-old XF, because I was doing a lot of long-distance driving when I was working for Du Tour. Even going sometimes down to the Chateau and back from here in Port Hope. So that was
nice to have something you enjoy being in.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted something comfortable, something big, that would do that journey, and I wouldn't feel completely knackered at the end of it. But now I sort of think, well, this really is a bit large and pretentious of me driving around, going into town in Whakatane. Maybe it's about time I downsized to something, looking at maybe a hybrid or something like that.
I just wanted to ask, you've been in that hot seat, running the nation's finances. What, if anything, does that teach you about money and how money, and in your own life, I guess, at all?
Well, the interesting thing about running the country's finances is that it's quite different from running your own or from running a business's finances. And when people say, you need business experience to be a Minister of Finance, I say, well, actually, it might not help in some ways, because if you're running a country from my perspective of how to manage the macroeconomy as opposed to microeconomic reform, you're basically always trying to lean against whatever's the natural tendency at the time. So if the economy is running down, you're trying to let natural stabilizers or even specific intended actions pump it back up again. If the economy is overheating into what I call in the book I'm writing the naughty phase, borrowing and spending, borrowing consumption, then you're trying to lean against that. With the Reserve Bank, obviously, you're also doing that. You're trying to actually reduce that heat in the economy. Whereas if you're running a small business, if times are tight, then you tend to cut back on expenditure. And I think one of the problems in the past, before the last 25, 30 years or so, is that's exactly what governments used to do. I mean, if things were getting tight, they cut back on capital expenditure and you keep the operational expenditure going. In fact, you really need to make sure you're trying to keep that capital expenditure moving. Well, in fact, it's easier to do it because if there's spare labour capacity, if interest rates are lower, then it's more efficient to spend in that time. And I think people still very much think in terms of cash budgeting. I mean, if you try and talk about the way the government accounts are created and sort of generally agreed accounting practice approach to budgeting, the vast majority of people's eyes quickly glaze over because it just seems completely counterintuitive to them.
All right, look, that's great. So just finally, you're in terms of next purchases and things, it's pretty much
probably a coffin actually, but we've got a cheap wooden one lined up. Next purchases, probably maybe after Christmas, depending on how things are going. Might look at down trading my car and getting something which, when Anne's current little Ford Fiesta Buzz Bomb needs replacing, and I'm not here, then that would be a good car for her to carry on with.
But
my car's a bit big.
You're not trying to sort of splash out, and I know that you are battling a real time frame here, and it's not a sort of sense of needing to indulge yourself or.
No, well, we had to cancel a trip to North Queensland in July because of COVID, and we actually were due to go to Croatia in September. So in recent years, we've usually done one sort of modest 1 to 2 week overseas trip each year. Whether we'll resume that or not, I don't know, because you just don't know how long this is going to go, and you're not going to feel safe. And I don't just have at the moment reasonably non-active lung cancer. I've also got asthma and a few other issues. So I am distinctly, and my whole immune system is actually a bit shot. So I'm very much immunity deprived. So I'm at serious risk if I come into contact with something like COVID. So we're going to be pretty cautious, I think, about doing that. We've got 4 kids between us. They've all got children, nearly 2 each. There's a second on the way for our youngest child due in a matter of days.
Yeah.
So and we're really lucky. They all live in New Zealand. They live between where we are and Auckland, so they're within driving distance. So we are enormously favoured by the standard of many Kiwi families in that regard. So seeing them is as important a part of life as any.
Yeah,
they've been a great support to me in recent months.
It's a cliche, and this is a show sort of about money, but a theme that comes through really is that when you get down to it, it really is some of those simple things in life that are the ones that you hold on to.
But it's also the ability. I mean, if Rebecca goes into labour, the next minute, because I've got to take the car in for a job on it tomorrow, Anne can hop on a plane up to Auckland without us thinking about the cost. And it comes back to what you're saying before, Liam, about you don't have to be as rich as John Key to have choices in life.
As you could have said, Warren Buffett.
I'm nothing like in the same league as that. Our total savings are a tiny percentage of John's worth. But that's still sufficient for us to have significant choices and not to feel constrained and we can't do this and no, we can't afford to do that and so on and so forth. And all right, one of our children needed help with getting a bigger house recently, and we were able to provide some bridging finance for them without thinking really twice about it. Those sorts of things. But a lot of New Zealanders, that's not true, and we do have to think very hard about how we can do that. And I would say, and I make the point again in the book I'm writing, I do think that our total government expenditure needs to be somewhat higher. And the constraint on that is not so much government ideology, or particularly not the current government. But the fact is, middle New Zealand's not prepared to pay more taxes to do that. And I find that we are very good in New Zealand at, I think it was the British High Commissioner put it rather neatly. I think she said that we have a Scandinavian taste for lifestyles, but we have an American taste for taxation.
Yeah.
And that leaves a rather large gap.
That's great, Michael. We'll leave it there. I think that there's some really interesting things to think about in terms of why we want to have some money, have some choices, and possibly share that opportunity for more people to have those choices. Yeah. So thank you very much for speaking to me, and best of luck for the health challenges in the months ahead. I look forward to that book.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you've got feedback, drop me a line at liam.dan@nzherald.co.nz. And if you want to hear more of these, please subscribe at iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts.